farming, the wheel, law, even the first written word. Ancient Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization because it was the people in this region of the world who first developed many fundamental aspects of society that we still need and use in our world today. Several empires ruled Mesopotamia over a period of some 1,800 years, between 2334 and 539 BCE. Mesopotamia was known as the land between two rivers, the Tigris to the north and the Euphrates to the south, a large region that today would spread through Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey. Mesopotamia was not a single nation or culture. Cultures would rise to power and then fall. Among the most powerful empires were the Babylonians and the Assyrians. But long before such empires were established, the Sumerians flourished as an independent city-state. Most historians have related the rise of the Sumerians to the discovery of bronze, which provided stronger and longer-lasting tools and weapons. This marked the beginning of what is known as the Bronze Age. They were also one of the first civilizations to develop the wheel, which revolutionized transportation. They engineered canals and irrigation systems to guarantee successful farming. And they developed cuneiform script, the earliest known writing system in the world. The Babylonians expanded their empire farther north along the Euphrates River. The most successful of the Babylonian kings was Hammurabi. He conquered and unified Mesopotamia. He was a very efficient ruler, establishing a centralized government, taxation, and the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known sets of written laws. These laws helped bring stability to the region after many turbulent years. Along with advancements in literature, astronomy, and transportation, the Assyrians are known for making great improvements in engineering and warfare, which made them one of the world's first great military powers. At the height of their rule, the Assyrians expanded Mesopotamia all the way from Iran to as far as Egypt. But like so many before them, Assyria's power weakened and the empire slowly dwindled. In 539 BCE, the empire fell to Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, and the days of the great empires of Mesopotamia came to an end. The earliest people of Mesopotamia were clans who hunted animals and gathered wild fruits and berries. When the clans had killed all the game in one area, they moved on to find new hunting sites. But by 9000 BCE, clans began developing small settlements. They no longer went out searching for food and increasingly started to rely on food they produced. This was the beginning of farming. This major cultural shift has a name, the Neolithic Revolution, which refers to the world's first transition from hunting and gathering communities to agriculture and settled societies. Mesopotamia has been called the Fertile Crescent. The name comes from the shape of the land, which is similar to a crescent moon. Desert surrounds the crescent, but within the region of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, fruit, vegetables, and grain grow quickly, a perfect setting for the Neolithic Revolution. Slowly, small farming groups evolved into towns. The farmers produced more grain and vegetables than they needed. They traded extra products with people who had stone, wood, metal, or other goods that were not found in farming communities. Trade along the two rivers expanded, and by 4000 BCE, towns exploded into cities. One of the earliest was Eridu, which was known for its many temples built to honor the gods. These temples were called ziggurats and were made out of mud bricks. Around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians emerged as a distinct culture along the banks of the Euphrates. This land needed to be drained to make it useful, and the Sumerians solved this problem by digging canals, which rerouted the water and divided the marshes into farmland and water. Farmers at the time also invented more effective plows that were pulled by domesticated oxen. This helped expand farming from tiny plots to large fields. And so, the Sumerians advanced from farming for individual families to farming for entire cities, cities that held a thriving culture and became the foundation of an advanced civilization. Religion, social class, and law were the center of Babylonian culture. In the Old Babylonian period, the great Babylonian king Hammurabi is known as one of the first rulers to have instituted written law, and these laws applied to all classes. Babylonians had three social classes. The upper class was called Awilim, which included royalty, property owners, priests, as well as military leaders. The middle class, Mushkenim, included craftsmen, artisans, merchants, and farmers. The lowest class, Wardum, were slaves. But regardless of class, Babylonians believed in and held to the law. Hammurabi claimed that the idea to make a formal legal code was brought to him by the gods. His laws, which were first written around 1780 BCE, are known as the Code of Hammurabi and are etched on a massive stone column that stands over 7 feet tall. In all, there are 282 laws and their accompanying punishments. Crowning the column is a depiction of Shamash, the sun god, who ruled over justice as he delivers instruction to King Hammurabi standing before him. During the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, in the Neo-Babylonian period, the city of Babylon developed into an architectural wonder. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon and the Tower of Babel are among Nebuchadnezzar's major building projects. Surrounding the royal palace, Babylon had several high fortified walls that protected the city. People entered through elaborately decorated gates. The Ishtar Gate, the most spectacular, was constructed of blue glazed brick. The walls and passageways were decorated with figures of bulls, dragons, and lions, all of which had symbolic significance. The lion, for instance, was a symbol of the goddess Ishtar, who ruled over love and war. With the advancements in agriculture and architecture and a legal system in place, the groundwork for modern societies was laid by these ancient inhabitants of modern-day Iraq. Mummies, pyramids, Cleopatra. These are just a few of the things that come to mind when we think of ancient Egypt. For more than 1,500 years, from 1539 BCE to 30 BCE, Egypt's empire was centered on the Nile River. One of the world's longest rivers, the Nile offered an important oasis against the harsh climate of the desert for the early settlers. And long before it was an empire, there were really two Egypts, dictated by the geography of the Nile. The narrow Nile Valley gave birth to what was called Upper Egypt, and the wider delta, where it empties into the Mediterranean, was home to Lower Egypt. But around 3100 BCE, the two lands were united by a chieftain called Narmer, laying the foundation of what would become the world's first superpower and one of the longest-lasting civilizations the world has ever known. Over the next 3,000 years, ancient Egypt saw 34 dynasties and over 300 kings, queens, and pharaohs. Some of the best known are Tutankhamun, or King Tut, Ramses, and Cleopatra. Some of Egypt's most impressive achievements include the development of the pyramids, obelisks, mummification, and a 365-day calendar much like the one we still use today. They also invented hieroglyphic writing, beautifully designed drawings that constituted a sort of alphabet, but with hundreds of different symbols. Egypt's empire was at its largest from 1539 to 1075 BCE and stretched from modern-day Sudan all the way to the Euphrates River. Eventually, outside invaders such as the Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks dominated Egypt. By 30 BCE, the Romans were at the doorstep. Cleopatra committed suicide rather than face defeat. And soon after, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The architectural and engineering wonders that often defined the great Egyptian empire were built during the Old Kingdom, Egypt's first prolonged period of great achievement. But they were in many ways the result of the beliefs of the people who first migrated into the area of Upper and Lower Egypt thousands of years before. Early Egyptians lived in small villages near the edge of the Nile. They understood the importance of the Nile to their lives and worshipped it as a god. They worshipped many gods and believed deeply in life after death. The Egyptians thought eternal life required the body to be preserved. To prepare the dead for this journey, they'd wrap them in mats or hides and bury them in shallow pits in the sand. These graves often included jars of beer and food and personal belongings. In the hot, dry sand, bodies dried out before they could rot. This created natural mummies and early crude versions of what would later become elaborate tombs to honor the kings. The first to build such a tomb was King Djoser. He wanted to do something different for his afterlife. His chief official, Imhotep, was a brilliant engineer who helped him construct the world's first known pyramid, the Step Pyramid. Later kings also wanted pyramids, and many poured all of Egypt's resources into making sure their afterlife would be as luxurious as possible. Around these royal tombs, they also built a necropolis, a city of the dead, where tombs were laid out like a well-planned town. Khufu, the second king of the 4th dynasty, spent his entire 25-year reign getting ready for his afterlife, building the biggest pyramid of all, the Great Pyramid, which took the art and science of pyramid building to heights never seen before. His son, Khafra, built his slightly smaller pyramid next to his father's, and he added a unique touch, a great sphinx, a giant statue of a lion with a human head and Khafra's face. He is lying down at the entrance of the necropolis, as if to guard it. No one is sure exactly how the Great Pyramids were built, or how long they took, but it's clear that during the Old Kingdom period, all of Egypt's advances in architecture, sculpture, art, and hieroglyphic writing were all focused on one thing: designing, building, decorating, and maintaining the king's tomb and vast necropolis. Much of what we know about ancient Egyptian life comes from tombs, where paintings, murals, carvings, and sculpture show everyday life. Art was created for religious, symbolic, or magical purposes, not artistic expression. And this meant daily offerings and prayers honoring the gods, of which there were thousands. The Egyptians believed that their gods and goddesses could take any form: human, animal, a natural force like the Nile River, or any combination. The structure of society is also depicted in Egyptian art. The king is always bigger than anyone else. Nobles are larger than commoners. Men are larger than women. If you think of Egyptian society like a pyramid, the king was at the top. At the broad base of the social pyramid were peasants, who made up 80% of the population. In between were priests, government officials, artisans, tradesmen, and soldiers. Egyptians were courteous, law-abiding people. The guiding principle of Egyptian law was based on Mat, an Egyptian word that includes the concepts of balance, order, justice, and harmony. The most enduring of Egypt's contributions is their calendar, which was incredibly accurate for its day. It consisted of 12 months of 30 days, with an additional 5 days added to the end of the year, making it the first 365-day calendar. And Egyptians were also at the forefront of cosmetics. Men, women, and children of all ages and social groups wore heavy eye makeup called kohl. This elaborate eye paint was a fashion statement as well as a form of religious devotion, and it was also quite useful because the thick eye paint offered protection against the glare of the sun and the blowing sand, like an ancient version of sunglasses. We may not lay our makeup on as thick these days, but Egyptian styles of design and ornamentation have long influenced architecture, fashion, hairstyles, jewelry, and much more. And the more mysteries we uncover from this ancient civilization, the more intrigued we become. Democracy, philosophy, mythology. These are just a few of the lasting legacies from ancient Greece. While the Athenian Empire spanned 3.5 centuries, from about 500 to 146 BCE, Greek civilization goes back much further, to about 1600 BCE. Ancient Greece was never a unified country. Rather, it was a collection of about 1,500 independent city-states that functioned as separate nations, scattered throughout the Mediterranean. But these people shared a common language and culture, including a belief in many gods and goddesses that ruled parts of the natural world. To honor their chief god, Zeus, they organized in the 8th century BCE the first all-Greek games, where men came together in Olympia to compete in races, wrestling, and other athletic events. The Greeks continued to hold these Olympic Games every 4 years for the next 1,000 years. What's known as the Archaic Era brought important changes in Greek society. Philosophers of the day doubted that the gods arranged everything and began asking questions about the universe, which led to studies in science, medicine, and math. At the same time, governments once ruled by kings and emperors were being replaced by councils of aristocrats, a form of government in which a few of the most prominent citizens ruled. In the classical Greek era, the city-state of Athens became the heart of Greece, with enormous achievements in art, drama, and architecture. Athenians developed a new form of government called democracy, run by the people. And Athens also had a very strong military, which it used to take control of other city-states and spread democracy. But this increasing power angered Athens' main rival, Sparta. The two cities went to war with each other in a conflict known as the Peloponnesian War. This long civil war severely weakened the Greek city-states, and as a result, they fell to the emerging superpower from the north, Macedon, and its ruler, Alexander the Great. Classic literature like the Odyssey and Aesop's Fables, the birth of tragedy and comedy in theater, the scientific method, and the Pythagorean theorem. These are just a few examples of the rich culture left to us by the ancient Greeks. The Greek philosophers were original thinkers. Before them, people always assumed the answers to many questions about the world were found in religion. Why does it thunder? It thunders because the god Zeus is angry. But philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle believed they could discover answers about the world through observation and thought, leading to studies such as botany, biology, and astronomy. In sculpture, the Greeks began featuring more humans in their work, rather than just gods. This led to greater realism and attention to detail, like the sculpture of Discobolus, the discus thrower. The Greeks also had an admiration for symmetry and balance in the world, and they believed it should be included in their architecture. The two main styles of architecture in ancient Greece were Doric and Ionic. Doric columns are wider, sturdier, and more simply styled than the slimmer, more decorative Ionic columns. Although there were countless temples and theaters throughout the empire, the most impressive buildings are often considered those of the Acropolis in Athens, including the Parthenon. This magnificent temple is Doric in style and was richly decorated with a 524-foot frieze or sculpted band around the top. Greek architecture had a lasting impact on Western architecture. The classical Greek styles are often seen in many important buildings throughout Europe and North America today. And in this way, they further connect the present system of government to the greatness of Athenian democracy. The men who first governed America wanted to give the people a greater role in government and wanted to protect individual freedoms. They wanted a democracy for the new country. The idea of democracy was first developed in ancient Greece, in the city of Athens. The word itself is made up of two Greek words, demos, which means people, and kratos, meaning power. Early Greek communities started as monarchies, with chieftains or kings in control. These were replaced with oligarchies, where councils made up of the city's wealthiest families ran the government. Around 700 BCE, Greek citizen soldiers began to demand a greater say in political affairs, since they were risking their lives to defend the lands. To avoid a civil war, the poet-politician Solon was chosen to make reforms in Athens' government. Solon desired a fairer balance between Athens' rich and poor. In 594 BCE, he created a set of written laws that spelled out the rights and duties of Greek citizens. He gave back to the poor land that had been taken from them as payment for debts, and all peasants who had sold themselves into slavery for being in debt were freed. More importantly, the idea was born that political power for a broader range of citizens and justice for all should be part of the law. Democracy took on its fullest form in Greece from 450 to 350 BCE with Athenian leader Pericles. During this period, all of Athens' male citizens participated in the government. Women and non-citizens, including foreigners and slaves, could not participate in Athens' democracy, and not all ancient Greeks practiced democracy the way the Athenians did. Many city-states never developed a democracy at all. However, Athens represents what we today consider to be best about the politics of ancient Greece, and their democratic government would inspire later political thinkers who were seeking to build free and fair societies. From language, to sporting events, and even baths and plumbing, the ancient Roman Empire has influenced the Western world for more than 2,000 years. The Roman Empire was dominant for about 500 years, from 27 BCE to 476 CE. And during that time, the Romans ruled a larger empire than any people before them. According to Roman mythology, two brothers, Romulus and Remus, founded Rome in 753 BCE. They were the sons of the Roman god of war, Mars, who abandoned them to die. A female wolf found the boys and raised them. And as adults, the brothers decided to start a city near the spot where they were rescued. The Roman people believed that their gods had chosen them to rule a growing empire, and they had several advantages that helped its expansion. Along with fertile land and access to waterways for trade, they also had a fierce army that was famous for its discipline and skill and outfitted with state-of-the-art arms and armor. These armies were led by great rulers like Julius Caesar and Octavian Augustus. Caesar emerged as the most powerful general and political leader in Rome until his political enemies assassinated him in 44 BCE. At its largest, in 117 CE, the Roman Empire included all of modern-day Spain and Portugal, part of Great Britain, large parts of southeastern Europe, and the sections of the Middle East and Africa that border the Mediterranean Sea. But Rome had reached its peak, and now it began a slow decline. The empire could no longer afford to have an army large enough to defend all its distant borders. In 286, the Roman Empire split in half. The western half saw growing attacks from barbarian and Goth or German invaders. And in 476 CE, the Goths took over the western half, marking the end of the Roman Empire. The city of Rome was the economic and political heart of the empire. And as the empire expanded, so did the variety of goods and materials that were available. From its earliest days, Romans had products they could trade with other people, such as wine and olive oil, which were transported in clay jugs called amphoras. The Romans traded in huge volumes and were able to get a variety of goods from a wide geographic area. Also, thanks to talented engineers, the Romans built long, straight roads that lasted for centuries, hence the saying, "All roads lead to Rome." And as the empire's trade expanded, wealth from the conquered areas flowed back to Rome. Another engineering feat was the Roman aqueducts that were built to bring water from surrounding hills to the city. Water flowed downhill all the way, so there was no need for pumping. These aqueducts were up to 50 miles long. The Romans also built elaborate public baths, which were as much social gathering spots as they were places to bathe. And they even had toilets with underground plumbing, allowing Roman citizens to enjoy surprisingly modern conveniences. While Roman influence was far-reaching, they also adopted many things from the cultures they conquered, including their religion. The most important Roman gods were greatly derived from the Greek ones. For example, the Roman god Jupiter, who ruled everything above Earth, is the counterpart of the Greek god Zeus. And the Greek god of the sea, Poseidon, is the equivalent of the Roman god Neptune. But during the first century of the Common Era, a new religion emerged from the East with its roots in Judaism, under the prophet Jesus. After the death of Jesus, a new faith emerged based on his teachings, Christianity. And the believers began spreading this new religion throughout the Roman Empire. The emperors did not like the Christians, and for several centuries they persecuted them, and followers had to gather in secret. However, in 313 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great, who had converted to Christianity himself, allowed people the privilege to freely practice the faith. Today, Vatican City, an independent city-state within the city of Rome, is the home of the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Forum was an area of ancient Rome that housed many important temples and buildings, and was the heart of the Roman social, economic, and political world, where republican government began. Though they borrowed heavily from the Greeks for inspiration in art and architecture, the Romans developed new building techniques to improve on Greek design. The greatest example is the Pantheon in Rome, a temple to all gods. It was designed with an opening at the top of the dome, allowing sunlight to illuminate the interior. Built around the year 125 CE, it is still standing today. Some of Rome's greatest architects designed and built structures for public entertainment. Emperors wanted to earn the loyalty of the people, and free entertainment was one way to accomplish this. The oldest and most popular public event in Rome was chariot racing. Chariot races were also part of a larger event known as the Games. Beyond the races, the Games also included theatrical performances, as well as contests and displays with wild animals. Huge theaters were built that could hold as many as 20,000 people. They also built large amphitheaters that could hold more than twice that many people, such as the famous Colosseum in Rome, which featured gladiators in combat. Gladiators were usually slaves, or convicted criminals or prisoners of war, and battled other gladiators, often to the death. And while the games we play in our modern-day Colosseums are not as brutal as those of the Romans, many of our sporting arenas have been influenced by this style of architecture. Perhaps the greatest daily influence of the Roman Empire is in the words people speak. Their Latin language led to the development of many spoken today, including French, Italian, Spanish, and English. And Latin is still a key part in many legal and medical terms used today. The Maya people left behind thousands of grand stone monuments and structures, temples, palaces, and pyramids engraved with scenes from Maya mythology and portraits of powerful kings. For over 1,000 years, these kings ruled the ancient Maya Empire, from about the year 250 until 1697. The land of the ancient Maya lies in an area that is now called the Yucatan Peninsula, including southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and western Honduras and El Salvador. Long before the Maya culture emerged, there was a civilization sometimes called the Mother Civilization. From about 2000 to 1000 BCE, the Olmecs, as we now call them, were the first Mesoamericans to establish communities led by a chief. The Olmecs are famous for their giant carvings of heads. These huge stones weigh an average of 20 tons. This culture, rich with mythology and ceremony, influenced the people of the Maya Empire. The ancient Maya were united by a common culture and a shared mythology, but they were never united under one ruler. During their peak, the Maya were divided into at least 60 individual independent kingdoms that were often in conflict with one another. From 250 to 800 is considered the Classic Era, the golden age when many capital cities were developed. The Terminal Classic period, from 800 to 900, began the decline of the empire, when a combination of overpopulation, warfare, and overexploitation of the environment and resources forced people to seek a better life elsewhere. That migration resulted in the Post-Classic Era, from 900 to 1524. This is when the Maya flourished in the northern Yucatan along lakes, rivers, and coastal areas. Near the end of the post-classical era is when Spanish armies and conquistadors came, determined to settle and control the land. Unlike other empires of the area, like the Aztecs, it took hundreds of wars in hundreds of settlements for the Spanish to dominate. But by 1697, the Spanish had colonized the land of the Maya people. The different kingdoms of the Maya Empire shared a distinct class system. At the top were royalty, kings and their families. Below them were the elites or nobles. Then there were farmers and workers of all types. At the very bottom were slaves, who were often captives of war. Warfare was a common occurrence in the ancient Maya world, as the kings would regularly set out on royal raids to obtain enemy captives who were used as slave laborers and in ritual sacrifices. Large city centers included palaces for the royal family, elite members of the community, and their servants and slaves. There were also pyramids, temples, administrative buildings, and monuments, all built from stone. Some buildings were used to observe the stars. The Maya were masters in astronomy. They accurately measured and dated the movement of the sun, moon, and planets across the sky. And many of their buildings reflect this interest. Like Caracol, the observatory at Chichen Itza, it looks remarkably like a modern observatory with its dome roof and slits of windows for observing the skies. The Maya had two calendars. One was a religious calendar with 260 days, and each of the 20-day names was associated with a different god. The Maya combined this religious calendar with a 365-day solar calendar that corresponded to the solar year, much like the one we use today. Outdoor plazas were the heart of the city. They built courtyards to accommodate huge audiences for rituals, festivals, and selling goods. And almost every major city had at least one ball court. The Maya believed that the ball game they played was more than simply a sport, but indeed a contest of life and death. The losing team was ultimately killed in sacrifice to the gods. Like many ancient cultures, the Maya practiced polytheism, meaning they worshipped many gods. There were gods associated with the natural world, like wind and rain gods, gods associated with the heavens, sky, moon, planet, and stars, and gods associated with agriculture, maize or corn gods, and even chocolate gods. Maya kings, priests, and elites claimed to have special powers, which enabled them to mingle with the gods and serve as a bridge between the supernatural world and the human world. It was the ruler's responsibility to please the gods through festivals and elaborate rituals that were part of daily Maya life. People of all levels in society, not just the elite, sought guidance and blessings from the gods. The primary purpose of Maya rituals was to make offerings to the gods to nourish them. Ritual sacrifices were considered a privilege. For the Maya, the greatest sacrifice was life itself, and the ultimate sacrifice was offering a human to the gods. Another ritual that still attracts people from all over the world takes place at Chichen Itza, one of the most famous of the Mayan archaeological sites. On the afternoon of the equinox, when days and nights are approximately the same length around the equator, a giant snake appears to descend down the Great Pyramid in the form of shadow and light, signaling the most important time to plant the food staple of the Maya, corn. Ancient stonemasons carefully designed and aligned this stone pyramid to project the sun's rays into the snake form precisely on these dates. And still to this day, each year during the biannual equinox, around March 20th and September 22nd, thousands flock to Chichen Itza to view the same dramatic display that was seen hundreds of years ago. The word Persian is often used to describe a rug, or a market, or maybe a type of cat. But these things are the remains of a fierce powerhouse, the ancient Persian Empire. The Persians dominated the greater part of their known world for over 1,200 years, from 550 BCE to 651 CE. The early Persian homeland was centered in modern-day Iran. From there, the empire grew to cover an area that stretched from Central Asia to Egypt and along the fringes of southern Europe, making them the first civilization to control parts of 3 continents. The long-standing Persian Empire was actually 3 distinct dynasties of Persian people who rose to power at different times. The first was the Achaemenid dynasty, which was founded by Cyrus the Great, who in 559 BCE united all the people of Persia. He and his successors were a dominant power for over 200 years, conquering some of the world's first great civilizations. But it was in their struggle to control the Greek Empire that this dynasty met its demise. After many years of battle, Alexander the Great conquered the Achaemenids in 330 BCE. Despite Greek dominance, the Persians never considered the Greeks their rulers, and several centuries later, the second dynasty of Persia, the Parthians, rose to power and eventually controlled much of the same lands as the Achaemenids. But during this same period, the Roman Empire had grown to become the dominant force in the area. The Parthians and Romans clashed in 53 BCE and continued to battle for almost 250 years. Fighting with the Romans weakened the Parthians, and eventually they were replaced by the third Persian dynasty, the Sasanians. The Sasanian dynasty took over in 224 CE, and once again began taking back lands that the previous Persians had controlled. By the middle of the 7th century, the Sasanian Empire was crushed by a new power, the Arabs of Saudi Arabia, bringing an end to the Persian Empire. Lasting from 559 BCE to 330 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was the first dynasty of the ancient Persian Empire. And it was under the rule of Darius the Great, the third king of this dynasty, that the empire strengthened and expanded. In about 522 BCE, Darius took the throne, and during his 36-year rule, he pushed the empire to what was at the time the largest and most powerful in human history. Like most rulers, Darius wanted concrete signs of his greatness and power. He began several huge building projects, including a palace in a new capital city called Persepolis, where stone columns as tall as a modern 5-story building towered over Darius and the many dignitaries and guests he welcomed. Along with building cities, Darius also introduced the first Persian coins, which were used throughout the empire. And he created a strong central government that lasted for more than 150 years. In 490 BCE, Darius set his sights on the Greek Empire. Along with wanting to control the prosperous trade routes, Darius wanted to show the Athenians that they should not interfere in Persian affairs or challenge his power. But the Greeks saw themselves as defenders of freedom and democracy and were opposed to the harsh rule of Persian kings. After Darius's death in 486 BCE, his successors continued to fight to rule Greece for the next 156 years, until they faced a new threat from the Greek world. Alexander the Great from Macedon had joined the Macedonian and Greek armies and finally defeated the Persians in 330 BCE. This brought to an end the Achaemenid dynasty and the first of the great Persian empires. The land and people the ancient Persians conquered provided a great deal of wealth and knowledge to the empire, and the Persians learned from the cultures around them. The Babylonians were very adept at astronomy. They began tracking the movement of the planets and stars around 700 BCE. This knowledge helped in developing calendars and predicting seasons for agriculture, and the Babylonians remained the key astronomers under Persian rule. The Persians were increasingly influenced by Greek art and culture, and they wanted elaborate city centers for government and ceremonial festivities. In Persepolis and the other capitals of the empire, the Persian architects blended existing styles of columns from Greece with their own designs. One local touch to the architecture was carving heads of bulls and griffins or other animals at the tops of columns. Some of the figures also combined human and animal features, such as giant winged humans or winged bulls, which were prominent throughout Persia, as were the stone reliefs carved into the royal palace walls. These are an important source of historical information and help us understand life at the Persian court. This one on the staircase at the palace of Darius shows visitors and Persian nobles bringing gifts to the great king. The Persians had skilled artisans who created beautiful and practical works of art, including ornate drinking cups called rhytons. The cone-shaped part held the liquid, and the lower part usually featured an animal, in this case a lion with wings. In Iran today, amid the busy streets, you can still find many skilled artisans making ornate pieces in the tradition that was so important to the people of the ancient Persian Empire. Alexander the Great was perhaps the most successful warrior in history. He ruled an empire that spanned approximately 2 million square miles over 3 continents. But it was not a long-lasting empire. He conquered and controlled his lands in a surprising 12 short years, from 336 BCE to 323 BCE. As a young prince in Macedonia, a kingdom on the border of modern-day Greece, Alexander was trained in physical fitness and warfare. He also had great teachers. The most famous was the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who taught him about philosophy, geography, science, art, law, and politics. Aristotle also instilled in Alexander a lifelong love of the writings of Homer, who expressed the ideals that honor and glory were achieved through personal success. During Alexander's reign, from the time he became king at age 20 until his death at age 32, he proved to be a powerful and charismatic leader. His army traveled thousands of miles with him, conquering everything in their path, never once losing a major battle. Ultimately, Alexander and his armies swept across vast regions from Macedonia through Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea to India and Central Asia, conquering nearly the entire known world of his day. As a warrior, he was famous for his brilliant tactics and strategy that would change the nature of warfare. He also brought Greek culture, language, and ideas of government to distant lands, laying the groundwork for civilizations that continue to this day. When Alexander died of a still undetermined illness, his huge empire quickly fell apart. But his legendary status increased as tales of his deeds were told and retold. Alexander the Great, King of Macedonia, is considered one of the most outstanding military geniuses of all time. In his battle for world conquest, Alexander overcame armies far more powerful than his by being smarter, more resourceful, and more determined than his enemies. The long-standing enemy of Macedonia was the Persian Empire, which had dominated the ancient world for more than 2 centuries. The Persian Empire stretched from Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea to India and Central Asia, and was the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom in the Middle East. When facing the Persians, Alexander was greatly outmatched in almost every way. They had more troops, more ships, and greater wealth. Yet, Alexander had a number of advantages that enabled him to overcome his enemy's strength and size. With his quick thinking, brilliant tactics, and strategy, he was able to exploit his enemy's weaknesses. His mechanics and engineers developed special weapons, including battering rams and catapults. And he was an expert at analyzing what his men and weapons could do. Alexander was able to seize opportunities that opened up during a battle and organize his troops on the spot to make the most of their abilities and to exploit his enemy's weaknesses and mistakes. He also had the loyalty of his men. In an age when generals and commanders were mostly aristocrats who had very little contact with their soldiers, Alexander was an exception. A courageous and even reckless leader, he was one of the last great commanders in history to lead his men on the battlefield. His helmet was made of gleaming polished iron, and long white feathers rose from it to make sure that even at great distances, his men could see that he was fighting alongside them. Alexander and his army crisscrossed the Persian Empire, traveling 20,000 miles, a distance about 6 times wider than the United States. In just 12 short years, Alexander conquered more lands and extended his leadership farther than any European ruler. The roads Alexander traveled throughout his conquered empire were key trading routes between the East and West. One of the most famous was known as the Silk Road. Goods, ideas, culture, and technology were carried back and forth along the Silk Road for centuries. And one of the most profound aspects of Alexander's brief reign was taking the art, science, and culture of the Greeks to new lands. The writings of Homer, astronomy and astrology, along with the teachings of the great Greek philosophers, all which were so important to Alexander, were introduced to a vast new group of people. Greek became the official language of government, education, and international trade. And while native languages continued to be spoken, all important discussions and documents were in Greek. This universal language made for a rapid exchange of ideas and knowledge over thousands of miles. But perhaps nowhere was the Greek influence more obvious than in city planning and architecture. According to the Greek model, public structures were needed for political, economic, and recreational activities. As Alexander conquered and founded cities, huge building projects became commonplace. This was certainly true in the new town of Alexandria, which he founded in Egypt. Alexandria grew into a worldwide center of culture and learning, and is still a thriving city today. Alexander's death marked the beginning of what's known as the Hellenistic period, a time when Greek culture flourished in parts of Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia for nearly 300 years. Although his reign was brief, Alexander had quite literally laid the groundwork for the continued spread of Greek ideas about politics, language, learning, culture, art, and philosophy for centuries to come. Markets in Timbuktu, unique mosques made from mud brick, vast caravans of camels, music that continues to influence famous recording stars, traditional hand-woven mudcloth. These are just some of the trademarks of the empires of medieval West Africa. There were actually 3 great empires that controlled West Africa from the year 500 to 1591. The area that is south of the Sahara Desert is an oasis from the harsh conditions the Sahara is known for, complete with vast grasslands for raising herds of cattle and planting various crops. It also has great rivers, such as the Niger and Senegal, providing fishing, irrigation, and transportation. These geographical features led to economic and military success in the region, laying the foundation for 3 successive empires. The Ghana Empire, which lasted from around 500 until 1076. The Mali Empire, from about 1235 until 1460. And the Songhai Empire, which began in 1469 and lasted until 1591. For more than 1,000 years, these empires ruled West Africa, spreading their influence in language, culture, economics, and most importantly, trade. They controlled the vast natural resources of the region, including salt, ivory, and gold, that were vital to their development and drew so many to the area. They also controlled the trade centers and caravan routes that transported these resources across the Sahara to the north. But while all 3 empires controlled these important trade routes during their reign, in 1591, the North African Kingdom of Morocco invaded and took control of the region, ending the reign of the Songhai Empire, the last of the 3 great empires of West Africa. The dominant people of ancient Ghana were the Soninke, and they called their land Ouagadougou in honor of the legendary founder of the Soninke people. Ouagadougou translates into Land of the Wago, the term for the Soninke aristocracy. They gradually expanded their territory and dominated neighboring rulers until the kingdom had become an empire, controlling the land north and east of the Senegal River from 500 to 1076. The Soninke people had many advantages that led to their rise. They had efficient food production with enough to trade in the region. They also had iron weapons and horses, enabling them to assemble a powerful army. But what eventually raised the kingdom to the level of an empire was that Ghana was well positioned to dominate the international caravan trade. From an early time, they engaged with the Sanhaja people, who had revolutionized the transportation of goods across the Sahara by using camels. Camels are known as the ships of the desert because they can carry heavy loads over long distances with little or no water, so the riches from the area could be transported across the Western Sahara and on to Europe and the Mediterranean. Products from the savanna areas included slaves, livestock, iron tools and weapons, locally woven and dyed cloth, clay pottery, and from farther south came valuable gold and kola nuts. Ghana gradually lost its dominant position. Climate change that made the desert expand into formerly fertile land and decades of struggle with the powerful people of the Western Sahara pushed many Soninke to move further and further away. The decline of the Soninke left a power vacuum in the Western Sudan until about 1235, when the Malinke, the people of Mali, joined together in a new state that would eventually rise to become the Mali Empire. The popular saying, "From here to Timbuktu," seems to place it at the very ends of the earth. But in fact, Timbuktu is a city in the modern Republic of Mali, where the Mande people live and work today. The Mande are descendants of the people of the Mali Empire, when Timbuktu was an important center for Islamic study and a market city for the trans-Saharan trade from 1235 until 1460. Mande society was organized into different groups based on status in the community. Descendants of the people who founded the empire were aristocrats, landowners, and leaders. Muslim clerics, religious leaders who were specialists in Islamic studies, made up another group. The unique mosques made from mud brick and wood can still be found throughout the country today. One of the longest-lasting social groups of the Mali Empire were and still are artisans, whose families have been producing the same crafts for many centuries, passing their knowledge and traditions along from generation to generation. Artists known as Jalou were responsible for the oral traditions of the Mande culture, keeping the deeds of the early ancestors alive through storytelling and music. Instruments such as the bala and the bolone are still used by Mande musicians today. Some are world-renowned, and their music has influenced many Western musicians as well. And during the medieval Mali Empire, slaves made up one of the largest groups. Muslim rulers of the day would send out raiders to capture non-Muslims in their villages, making them servants, soldiers, or sending them across the Sahara to be sold in North Africa. The Dogon, a non-Muslim people, fled to a region called the Bandiagara Plateau, where they could defend themselves from slave raiders by building their villages among big rocks at the base of high cliffs. Using mud bricks and stone, the Dogon architecture had a unique style that made their homes appear to grow naturally out of the cliffs. Today, Islam is one of the largest religions in the world and is also the state religion in many countries, including Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. This is in large part due to the empire of the medieval Islamic world. The Islamic Empire lasted for more than 600 years, from 632 to 1258. It grew from desert tribes scattered across the Arabian Peninsula into an empire with the most advanced culture and most powerful government in the world. That empire began with the religious movement and a man named Muhammad, who had received messages from Allah, which is Arabic for God. Muhammad began preaching about this revelation and soon attracted a number of followers. The new religion was called Islam, and its followers were called Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad was also a political leader and became the absolute ruler of the Islamic community. The messages he received became the laws of the religion, as well as the empire. When Muhammad died, his followers were divided in two over who would replace the great leader and be caliph or successor. These two factions are the Shiites and the Sunnis. After much controversy, the Sunnis selected the first four caliphs, known collectively as the rightly guided caliphs. They were in charge of the political and religious life of the Muslim community, and they directed the raids and wars that led to the expansion of the empire. Between the years 632 and 750, the Islamic world expanded to its greatest height, stretching from Spain and North Africa to India and Central Asia. But the power that would ultimately bring down the Islamic Empire came from Central Asia under the Mongol leader Genghis Khan and his family, who conquered the Islamic Empire in the early 1200s. From the earliest days of the Islamic Empire, trade was the most important industry. Early Muslim merchants were responsible for the wealth and prosperity of the empire. They also helped spread Islam, Arabic, and Arabian Islamic culture. Trade throughout the empire was primarily over land. Caravans of camels loaded with goods from India, Asia, and China trekked across the desert, carrying items such as grain, silk, cloth, precious gems, and metals. This trading brought Arabic influence into cooking by introducing important ingredients to Europeans, such as spices like ginger, turmeric, and coriander. Another important food contribution was sugarcane. This popular sweetener was one of the top commodities traded to Europe, and sweets of all sorts quickly became popular. Candy, caramel, and sugar are all Arabic in origin. Craftsmen throughout the empire shared their skills with one another, and the technology of one area soon spread to another. New techniques in metalworking, weaving, and leather tanning were eventually spread throughout Europe. The people wore simple clothing designed to protect themselves from the scorching rays of the desert sun. Muslim women wore a veil, head covering, and modest dress in public, including covering their arms and legs. This modest attire is still worn by many Muslim women today. In the homes, floor coverings were important to Muslims. Rugs were both practical and decorative. They served as places for prayer, rest, eating, and entertaining. Many of the designs on what we call Persian rugs came from Muslim carpet makers more than 1,000 years ago. The Islamic Empire was at its height during the early Middle Ages. Although this was a time when European culture was stagnant, lands under the control of the Muslims were experiencing what was called the Golden Age, with a great expansion in learning, commerce, and civilization. While much of the Islamic Golden Age was influenced by Greek and Persian culture, there were two major Arab contributions: the Muslim religion and the Arabic language. Arabic became the language of government and learning, and it replaced many languages throughout the empire. The Quran, the most important and earliest piece of Arabic writing, is the written record of the messages the Prophet Muhammad received from God. People who had heard him reciting and explaining God's word wrote these messages after his death. The most important message of the Quran is that there is only one God. Other important contributions of the Islamic Empire came in the field of medicine. By adding to Greek medical theory, the doctors of the empire were the most advanced of their time. The physician Al-Razi made long-lasting contributions to science and medicine, one of which we still use today. His classification of all things into three major groups: animal, vegetable, and mineral. One of the most lasting legacies of the Islamic Empire is the unique and distinctive architecture that still survives in many regions today. And the most important architectural achievement of the empire was the mosque. For Muslims, the mosque served as a place to worship Allah, but it was also the heart of the community. The mosque was the court of justice, a place for study, and even a shelter and place of sanctuary for weary travelers. During the early days of the empire, sculptures and images of people were prohibited in mosques and discouraged in general. Instead, other designs were used to decorate the mosques, including written script, geometric patterns, as well as plant and animal patterns. The Mongols have been described as both bloodthirsty conquerors as well as unifiers of Europe and Asia. But regardless of one's perspective, one thing is for certain: the Mongols, led by the mighty Khans, built a vast world empire faster than any people before or after them. The Mongol Empire lasted just under 200 years, from 1206 to about 1405. And yet, it was the largest area of land ever controlled by one ruling family. Dominating Eurasia, the land that includes most of Europe and Asia, the empire covered 22% of the land on Earth and had a population of over 100 million people. It all began when Chengiz Khan, who is often referred to as Genghis Khan, united the nomadic tribes of Great Horsemen, who moved from place to place in his homeland of Mongolia, just north of China. He and his descendants had one of the most powerful armies, successful in part because of their skill on horseback, which gave them great advantage in warfare, but also because they were expert archers and could move very quickly because their armor was made of leather or lightweight metal. They quickly conquered smaller empires and kingdoms that at the time were mostly sedentary, built around permanent towns and cities. And while these towns had great wealth compared to the Mongols, they could not match the military skill of the nomadic warriors. Between 1260 and 1264, the empire split into 4 mini-empires, each ruled by a descendant of Chenghis Khan. However, by the 1340s, the descendants of Chenghis Khan were out of power, and their lands were ruled by a series of local leaders. The last major rulers who had ties to the old Mongol Empire were the Mughals of northern India, and the old Mongol culture had just about disappeared as a result of their adapting to the various peoples they conquered. Only in their homeland of Mongolia and a few other pockets did the traditional ways endure. It took 20 years for Chenghis Khan to unite the nomadic tribes of Mongolia, and in doing so, he created a new nation with a large and ethnically diverse society. The tribes had a long history of conflict, and the Great Khan was determined to use his power to create order. Khan's decree turned into a collection of laws called the Great Yasak Legal Code. The laws enforced strict military discipline. For example, a soldier who did not stop to pick up a dropped bow or other equipment would be executed. And like many other cultures of the day, he also implemented taxation. Before the empire expanded, when the tribes were mostly herders, the Mongol leaders took a share of the people's sheep or goat herds as a tax. As they began to rule over people in towns and villages, the Mongols made each person pay a tax in goods or money. The Chinese had invented paper money several hundred years before the rise of Chenghis Khan, and the Mongols helped spread its use throughout the empire through their trade. Trade was a vital part of the Mongol Empire. Valuable products such as gold, silver, silk, and spices were carried all across Eurasia. The vast stretches of roads, created to send official communications throughout the empire, were also used as trade routes. These included the famous Silk Road, which links China and Central Asia across hot deserts and through high mountain passes to the Middle East. Through these trade routes, the Mongols also brought the culture and knowledge learned from conquered peoples to all parts of their empire, introducing distant cultures to one another. The nomadic Mongols lived in tents called gurs. Europeans called them yurts. Felt cloth made from sheep's wool was draped over a wooden frame. The gurs were round, with a hole in the center that both let in light and served as a chimney. The floor was covered with rugs or animal hides. Gurs were easy to set up and take down quickly, so they could be moved without much trouble. This was important for nomadic tribes who needed to move their herds around to ensure there was enough grass for them to graze on. Some Mongolian families today still move their herds from one pasture to another and continue to live in these portable homes. Under Mongol rule, cities bustled with economic activity. Merchants benefited because the Mongols welcomed trade throughout the vast empire. Under Kublai Khan, the third great Khan and Chenghis's grandson, Chinese society took on an international flavor, probably more so than any other nation at that time. From his throne in China, Kublai welcomed anyone from the vast empire who could help him develop his empire. This open-mindedness was widespread. The Mongols often integrated themselves into the different cultures they conquered, adopting customs and blending into their societies. And at a time when religious differences often led to war, they tolerated religious freedom. The various areas of the Mongol Empire were dominated by different religions. There was Christianity in Russia, Islam in Persia, and Buddhism in China. The different religions shaped the Mongol Khans' personal lives and their political decisions. The mountaintop retreat of Machu Picchu. Colorful textiles. Open-air markets. These are just a few of the examples from modern-day Peru that give us a glimpse into the Inca culture of the past. While the Incas left no written record of their civilization, their relics help tell a story of the vast society that once ruled almost the entire west coast of South America. The Incas spread their influence for nearly 400 years, from about 1200 until 1572. Their empire combined diverse cultures that worshipped many gods into one civilization ruled by a single man. Legend has it that it all began with Manco Capac, who under the guidance of their sun god, brought together different tribes of the area into the Peruvian village of Cuzco and became the empire's first supreme leader, called the Sapa Inca. Over the next 300 years and under 13 different Sapas, the Inca Empire grew and flourished, conquering neighboring cultures along the Pacific Ocean. At its peak, it stretched from present-day Ecuador down to modern-day Chile and Argentina. This expansion, including a system of paved roads and elaborate cities with buildings that still stand today, was supported by efficient farmlands and great riches, such as the gold that poured in from the mines within the Andes Mountains. In the early 1500s, Spanish conquistadors, or conquerors, led by Francisco Pizarro, were exploring South America, what they called the New World. They marveled at the wealth of the Incas, and while they were also determined to convert the Incas to Christianity, these were not missionaries. They were invaders. They desperately wanted the Incas' gold. The Incas fought the Spanish invaders, but during that time, other factors weakened them. Smallpox, as well as other European diseases, spread throughout the empire, killing many thousands. In addition, the Incas were divided among themselves in a brutal civil war. In the end, the Incas could not prevail, and by 1572, the last Inca outpost fell into ruin. The Inca civilization thrived with very little hunger, poverty, crime, or corruption. But in many ways they were unsophisticated. There was no written language or a number system. And they lacked one of humanity's greatest inventions, the wheel. Without the wheel, carts were not an option. And without carts, horses or oxen, trade and transportation was limited. The Incas did have boats and rafts, but they were usually used for short-distance travel or for fishing. Rafts on mountain rivers and lakes were made of reeds and occasionally logs, but they were not strong enough to carry heavy loads. This was the work of humans and llamas. Providing food for a growing empire in the high altitude of the Andes Mountains took some ingenuity. First, they built agricultural terraces along the hillsides. Humans and llamas carried millions of stones to form terraces, which were filled with soil and crops. Farmers grew many crops, including corn, potatoes, beans, squash, fruit, and dozens of other plants and herbs. While only nobles grew and possessed the coca plant, they shared it with their workers as a medicinal herb. When the leaves were chewed or drank as a tea, it would aid the workers by helping to suppress their appetites, improve stamina, and reduce altitude sickness, as well as other ailments. They also had some inventive ways to preserve food. They were the first civilization to freeze-dry food. They used the cold mountain temperatures and the low air pressure of the high altitudes to keep the food from spoiling. One staple of the cuisine was, and still is, a form of dehydrated llama meat called charqui, something like the beef jerky eaten in the United States. And open-air markets of the Inca time were much like the ones that still exist in the region today, where people come to trade a variety of goods, from textiles, dyes, and crafts, to meat, vegetables, and fruit. The Inca culture of the past can still be seen in Peru today, where people continue to value and practice the arts and crafts that were handed down through the ages. The Incas described gold as sweat of the sun. Skilled goldsmiths and artisans turned the gold into various objects, including masks, statues, ornate knives, and drinking cups. Despite the vast amounts of gold, the Incas did not place the highest value on precious metals or gemstones. They valued cloth the most because of the amount of work involved in producing truly fine fabric. Weaving has religious and historical connections. The Inca citizens honored Mother Earth, or Pachamama, in woven cloth. Every Inca village had their own pattern. Still today, women spin, dye, and weave vicuña wool, the wool of a wild relative of the llama, into a yarn in the same way their ancestors did. Of all the legacies left by the Incas, surely their architectural achievements are the most enduring. This was a culture of master architects and stonemasons who built massive stone temples, courts, and cities. They developed masonry to such a high degree that they could build large stone buildings where the blocks fit together like jigsaw puzzles, so that the mortar between them is almost invisible. They understood how the shape of the land affects structures so well that many of the walls and buildings have held up over many centuries and withstood countless earthquakes. The most well-known buildings created by the Incas are at Machu Picchu. Once a country palace for the ruler, these ruins are the remnants of a remarkable city, with 150 houses, temples, baths, storage rooms, and palaces. Though it was hidden for centuries, Machu Picchu is now one of the world's most treasured sites, where every year, hundreds of thousands of people flock to the Andes to see the ancient city in the clouds. Brilliantly colored clothing, elaborate masks and weapons, and even human sacrifices were all part of the Aztec world. For many years, the Aztecs succeeded in uniting many different tribes into one empire, and from 1400 until 1521, they ruled a large portion of what is today central and southern Mexico. No one knows the true origins of the Aztecs, but legend says they began as one of 7 tribes, living in 7 caves in the area of Aztlan, from which they took their name. 300 years after the other tribes left, an eagle came to rest near the Aztecs' cave and cried out, "Let us go." This was the sign they had been waiting for, and in 1250 they settled on islands in Lake Texcoco. In 1325, the Aztecs received another sign that they should start a city. This time, it was an eagle on a prickly pear cactus. The city was called Tenochtitlan, meaning place of the prickly pear cactus. The city had marketplaces, temples, and public buildings, and became the center of the growing empire. Throughout the 14th, 15th, and early 16th centuries, due to their military dominance, the Aztec rulers accumulated more and more territory. And under the gifted leader and skilled warrior Moctezuma II, sometimes heard as Montezuma, the empire was at its peak. In 1519, the Spanish conquistadors arrived. They were conquerors, soldiers, and adventurers seeking glory and wealth while spreading the Catholic faith. And by 1521, Hernán Cortés and the Spanish army took control of the city of Tenochtitlan, marking the end of Aztec power. But even today, the image of an eagle sitting on a cactus is the symbol of Mexico and appears on the country's flag, a memory of the ancient Aztecs who once ruled this land. At the height of the Aztec Empire, the capital city of Tenochtitlan had a population that varied from 100,000 to 300,000 people, and in their culture, every healthy person was expected to work. The economy was based on farming, so most people earned their living growing food. The land the Aztecs farmed was not fertile enough to grow all the food they needed, so they developed distinctive methods of farming. In the mountains, the Aztecs built terraces to grow food on hillsides. And in lower lands, they created chinampas, unique island farms that allowed them to grow crops in the marshes and swamps. The main crop was maize, or corn, but the Aztecs also grew other vegetables, including avocados, beans, chilies, squash, tomatoes, and onions. Other resources like gold and cotton also poured in from some of the newly conquered regions. The Aztecs had many skilled craftspeople, including feather artists and weavers. Food and crafts were traded in the marketplaces. The Aztecs had very definite ideas about social classes. People were born into their class, and few ever rose above it. There were three social classes: nobility, commoner, and slave. Games were popular among nobles and commoners, and often took place as part of rituals leading up to human sacrifices. Fans packed the seats to watch a game known as Tlachtli, a ball game with two opponents or two opposing teams. Contestants could use only their feet, knees, and hips to shoot the ball. Aztecs bet heavily on the outcome. People could bet their personal freedom, committing themselves to slavery if they lost their bet. Temples, music, masks and costumes. Even the calendar of the Aztec people revolved around religion. The Aztecs believed in many gods, and they believed that these gods influenced all aspects of a person's life. Thunder, lightning, too much or too little rain, sickness, and famine were all considered direct results of unhappy gods. To keep the gods happy, the people made different offerings such as food, arts and crafts, and even human sacrifices. Music and dance accompanied most religious festivals. The Aztecs had many wind and percussion instruments, including rattles, shakers, and a variety of drums. Aztec craftsmen created masks to frighten the enemies in warfare, and also for religious ceremonies. Feather artists helped create the ceremonial costumes and large ornate headdresses that featured feathers from the tropical birds of the region. The Aztecs had an excellent understanding of astronomy, the science of the stars and planets, which led to the development of two Aztec calendars that are actually far more complex than the one we use today. The religious calendar was called the Tonopohualli. It consisted of two linked wheels. On one wheel were 20 symbols representing days, with names such as rabbit, deer, and skull, or death. The other wheel had numbers 1 through 13, similar to months. The two wheels moved together until the 20-day names and 13 numbers reached 260 days, marking the end of this religious calendar. And like many ancient cultures, the Aztecs built massive pyramids to show their respect for the gods. They also worshipped at temples left behind by earlier cultures. In the ancient city of Teotihuacan, they named the two largest pyramids found there after two of their own powerful gods, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon.